What's it like? What's it like to be a teacher in the eye of the storm? What's it like to be a teacher in the current policy context? What's it like to be a primary school teacher in a challenging school in these policy times? Now, I've said that these are impossible times. They're times, to me, that seem to be trying to change what the work is of a teacher and what it is to be in a school. English primary schools have been subjected to an almost continual flow of educational reforms aimed at raising standards, improving literacy and numeracy, and other forms of curriculum interventions. The reforms that we've seen are carved out of two main discourses. The first one is a discourse of derision, a derision about the alleged failings of what's commonly called progressive education. Now, for a short time, and very briefly in England in the 1960s, English primary schools were seen as progressive. We were the Finland of primary education in the 60s. People used to come and see our primary schools and see child-centeredness and creativity. And even though a lot of it was rhetoric rather than practice, nevertheless, since this time, there's been discourse after discourse, politicians saying that the problem with the primary school is they're all too progressive, they're not teaching the kids anything, they're out there playing with them in the park, they're not actually teaching them to read and write. And it demonises certain ways of teaching. These are transgressive teachers who are doing this. These aren't the sort of teachers that we want. What Ken Jones in my country calls a cultural nostalgia for an older way of teaching, teaching by rote, teaching for tests, teaching children to learn vast chunks of poetry. I'm not against learning poetry. I think it's wonderful, but I think there are other things as well as. And this older version of how to learn and how to teach crystallised in the raising standards discourse. And so what happens is we've got a similar discourse, which is a discourse of crisis. Do you really believe 20% of children in my city can't read or write? But what does a headline like that say to parents? So we have these discourses of derision around what's happening in primary schools. And so, in a sense, the result has been a series of policy interventions into primary school in these heated, and I would say probably overcooked areas of literacy and numeracy, alongside accelerated calls for accountability and blame. And while literacy and numeracy have received the most attention, other matters have become less central to the primary school, helping to develop good people, thoughtful people, people who are learning about who they are and who they are becoming. Turning to discourses of neoliberalism, there are two key features that have resonance in the English primary school. There's been the insertion of market forces as an antidote to alleged poor standards, the market fixing the problem of state schooling, and there's been a very serious relaxedness about who provides education, private, of course, being best and preferred. The arguments that underpin this suggest that public service education developed and delivered by people like you and me is of low quality. It's unresponsive, it's risk-averse, it's stultified. And the neoliberal solution is to open up education to markets, to parental choice, and to competition, and to allow new providers in, including for-profit providers. How can you make a profit out of special educational needs? Morally, how can you do that? How can you make a profit? We've now got private people providing education for what we call looked after children, children in care of the state because their parents are at that moment unable to provide that. How can you actually make a profit out of those sorts of children? Is there not something distasteful? Sally Tomlinson in our country has traced the avalanche of reforms that have come out in relation to this, characterising the pull-out of welfarism in our state sector, what we now call post-welfarism. Competition, the market commodification of education, the rhetoric of raising standards, emphasis on regulation, inspection, assessment, the modernisation of teachers, regular reforms to the curriculum, cutting back of local democratic accountability, performance-related pay, vast attempts at producing, monitoring and surveying the work of teachers in schools. A panoply of targets driving all policy before them. In parallel to all of this, we have the growth of the entrepreneurial head teacher and the celebration of hero entrepreneurs as models for school leadership. We have head teachers. There's one head teacher in London near to me who actually has built a building and a swimming pool, which he lets out to other people. He lets rooms in the building to his teachers. He makes business out of that. So what we're seeing is a hybrid state that's developing in England, where the central state is divesting itself of responsibilities for overall planning through establishing new schools and new chains of schools that are independent of the local state, yet paradoxically still asserting its capacity to control. It's a very contradictory thing. You've got the freedom, but no, you haven't.